I'm sitting with Justice Conference fave, in-demand spoken poet, artist, Micah Bournes.
Yes, sir.
Right here at the gathering. We're so glad you're here.
Oh, good to be here.
John Wooden used to do a thing when he was doing his first practice. He would pull out a basketball and he would say, "Gentlemen, this is a basketball." You do spoken word.
Yeah.
Help us understand. What is spoken word?
Yeah, I often do that. I was like, this is spoken word poetry, because even though it's been around a while, a lot of people aren't familiar with the art form. But I explain it like this. It's poetry, but it's like the difference between writing a novel and writing a script for a film or a play. If you're an author and you write a novel, you expect your audience to read it on paper. But if you write a script for a film, you don't want people to read it. You want them to watch as the actors perform what you've written. So it's poetry meant to be performed instead of read. And so it changes the way you write. And it also incorporates a lot of nonverbal, facial expressions and body language and all of that. So, I tell people all the time, I could say, how much longer do I have to hold this? If that was a sentence in a poem meant for the page in a book, you would need more information. But if I was performing it in a spoken word poem, I could go, "Oh, how much longer do I have to hold this?" Or, "How much longer do I have to hold this?" And even though I didn't add any words to the sentence, I'm holding something heavy or I'm holding something that stinks. So it's poetry that incorporates all forms of body communication.
But it definitely impacts the emotions. You said it turns ugliness into beauty.
Yeah.
What is it about the power of the spoken word?
Yeah, for me, how I first got introduced to spoken word poetry, it was summer before my junior year of college, and I got invited to an open mic up in LA, and it was people I did not know, and they weren't professional poets. Most of them were younger folk, college-age students, and they were standing on stage one after another, and they're sharing things that I had experienced, but when I had experienced them, I thought I was the only person in the world who felt this way. Wow. And I thought, you're not allowed to say something like that because everyone will judge you or think you're crazy or whatever. And yet, I'm in this room and person after person is like taking the mask off, and instead of stones being thrown at them, everyone in the room is like, "Me too." Oh, and it was so liberating to know that so many other people have dealt with so many of the same things I had dealt with. And I had never been in any environment where people were just able to be that honest about their life experiences. So that was the first draw, that community, that sense of connection with complete strangers via art. And I had already been making music for a while, but there was something particular about spoken word poetry that I think art in general lends itself to vulnerability, but this specific art form I found to be the most vulnerable as folks are just telling their stories. Yeah.
Now, let me back up a little bit. You actually did not grow up very far from here, so you're a Long Beach.
Yeah,
Long Beach, California. Long Beach.
Yeah,
okay.
Born and raised. I was there until I was 18. Then I went to college in Chicago for 4 years. Then moved to Oregon for 2 years. But now I'm back in Long Beach.
What did faith? Because faith comes up in so much of your spoken word. You're diving deep into Old and New Testament. Mm-hmm. God is very much a part of much of what you have to say.
Yeah.
What did faith have to do with your growing up?
Yeah, I've been going to church since the womb. My parents were kind of old school believers, and so it's always been a presence in my life and a part of the culture of my life. As I got older in high school, really wanting to understand, this thing that we said is the most important thing. Am I just doing it because I was born into a Christian family? So I really, I wanted to know why I claimed to believe these things and why our family did these things. So for me, part of that journey of discovering and really owning my faith for myself was going to a Christian school. I studied theology in college, and it was interesting because my college wasn't necessarily the most creative environment in the sense of emphasizing the arts. However, for me, when I started writing during my college years, and so everything I was learning in class was just bouncing around in my head, and then I expressed those thoughts in poetry and song and music. So I was studying theology, philosophy, but then kind of on the weekends I started going to these open mics, and so it was just all the stuff that I was being challenged on bouncing around, and then that's kind of how my faith got woven into my art very naturally. And it was just at a time in life where I was studying theology. And then since then, I write about everything. Every experience to me is beautiful and important. But yeah, it's definitely a big theme in my work.
Now, you have a poem called Church Is, where you just rattle off a whole series of definitions.
Yeah.
Where did you get that? Was that something that was true to your experience, or was that something in which you're kind of looking, this isn't true for me, but this is true as I kind of serve as a critique of the culture in which I'm in?
Yeah, I would say probably the latter, in the sense of the more appropriate title would probably be Church Should Be. Because again, my draw to like the creative spaces that I started hanging out in was, man, I felt more connected there than I had in a lot of the kind of church spaces where, everyone was trying to be the good Christian. And, I grew up in youth group, and we never talked about so many things that everybody was doing. There's a philosopher named Michel de Montaigne, and he said, what he says, we have taught the young ladies to blush at the mere mention of what they are not at all afraid to do. And that was my experience with a lot of church environments for younger folks, especially. It's like, we can't say that, we can't talk about that, right. But we're all doing this. But since we're not allowed to talk about it, we can't really process the experiences and the pain and the questions we have about some of these things we're experiencing, And so with Church Is, I'm like, I wanted to paint a picture of, hey, what it could be, this vulnerability, this exchange, this community, instead of everyone trying to impress each other to show that we're never sinned in our lives because we're good Christians,
And so much of this that you were growing up also, as you stated earlier, in a kind of a hip hop culture. Who were some of the earliest hip hop artists that you were listening to?
Yeah, when it came to music and art, I had an interesting, I guess, dichotomy, because I grew up a church kid, and my mama loved music, and she was always singing like old school stomp clap black gospel music at home. But I also grew up in Long Beach during the 90s and 2000s. And the thing is, at the time, some of the biggest rappers in hip hop were from specifically Long Beach. Snoop Dogg was from Long Beach, Nate Dogg, Warren G, Corrupt. And so the community I was growing up in, like, these were our heroes. You know what I'm saying? So it was like I had the church music, but then I also had like this gangster rap. And it was a tension for me.
About to say, did that create some sort of a conflict?
It created some tension, but
themes that they were taking on.
It was the tension was multi-layered, because on one hand, I could not deny the beauty in the art form of hip hop. I was so drawn to it, so fascinated by it, and I didn't have the words for it at the time. But now that I write poetry, retrospectively, what I liked about hip hop, I was like, oh, they're good rappers or they're clever, but really, I was drawn to all the poetic devices that they employed. They were using metaphors and similes and double entendres and all these things that I'm like, yes, that's why I loved it, because I recognized the poetry in it. But because the content was often about gangster rap themes, specifically the rap I was listening to, not all hip hop is like that by any means, but it was like this kind of, it was this guilty pleasure. But it seemed like at the time everyone was extreme. It was all like, oh, it doesn't matter, just if you like it. Or they would throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, oh, this is all evil. And, right. And it wasn't, and it wasn't at all. So I struggled for a while, and then I ended up just finding artists who were making like faithful art, and not just like positive, happy stuff, but like, talking about real stuff and using the medium of hip hop in ways that was productive. And that I was like, oh snap, like this can be done. So, and that's when in college I started writing. I started with hip hop. I was rapping for 2 years before I got into spoken word. Well,
the words that you speak, in what I saw, and as I told you, I think I took as many videos as I could actually pull down and watched. And as visually interesting as it was the words that were catching me up. Some of these, like, we break English like chains. This is our native tongue.
Yeah.
How do you see the role of language in the spoken word? When you're communicating at colleges and universities, obviously the spoken word has that emotional impact, but it's the words that drive it.
Yeah.
How do you see words in this?
Yeah, I love that poem that you quoted. It's probably, I think, one of my most important and one of my personal favorites, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of particularly black culture in the context of America, and black slang and black jargon, black lingo, and it's associated with lack of intelligence.
And I think you were comparing it with Shakespeare.
Exactly, I was in that poem, but the idea is like, if you talk this way, then you don't talk proper, and the idea of proper English is absurd to me, because in America, even the, I guess, standard, what people would consider proper here, English doesn't come from America, it comes from England, and they speak English way different than we do, right? So who has the standard of what is proper, right? From the spellings to the pronunciations, but words, it's about communication. And so explaining in that poem that this is not a matter of right and wrong, this is a matter of culture. And if you're on the outside of a culture, you look, Jamaica is a bit more removed. So when you hear, a Jamaican person speaking patois, you don't say, oh, they're speaking English wrong, but that's an English-based dialect. But it's so far removed, then people are like, oh, well, it's Jamaican. It's the same thing here, even within America. And so I think I refer to Shakespeare because now Shakespeare is often seen as like the standard, the highest, utmost, best expression of English done well and beautifully and poetic, King James Bible-like type thing. But the ironic and humorous part of it is Shakespeare broke all kind of rules. Shakespeare made up words left and right. On ShakespeareOnline.com, they have this information about him. It says that he's credited for making up 1,700 words. And some of them were from nothing, but a lot of them were just breaking words in half and pasting them together. And so you're like, oh, snap. At the time, he was actually using slang. He actually was breaking rules. And it became so popular that now we think, oh, well, that's how you have to do it. So what was at the time this revolutionary thing has become like this standard of the old school, and it's very hypocritical. And so I'm like, most folks don't appreciate the way we talk. It's just because you don't know us and you're just not part of that culture. And if you did get to know us, maybe you would find something beautiful in it and learn how to communicate and see that it's just another artistic expression. So
watching your spoken word, there's probably not a subject that I found that you're not, you kind of dance in where angels sometimes fear to tread. You take on issues that need to be spoken about, but do it in a way that actually everyone can hear.
Yeah.
And in some cases, there's great pain that comes out of that. One of those is race relations. Right now, obviously, this may be one of the most difficult times in our nation's history. You can even name cities, St. Louis, Charleston, Charlottesville. And those cities don't just bring to mind places to go touring, they also bring to mind desperate situations where people feel not heard, feel injustice is being done. How do you speak into these kinds of situations to not only inform, but also you're pulling people towards something. You're saying, take a look at this, but I want you to come with me on this journey. Yeah. How do you do that?
Yeah, I found when you're talking about things that are that important and controversial, if I were to sit down and have a conversation with someone from a different culture or different generation about institutional racism or politics or faith, those would be very difficult conversations that maybe wouldn't last very long or go very well. But what I found is through the medium of art and storytelling, it goes past some of your initial defenses. So I started, to be honest, I did not start out intentionally writing about justice issues or racial issues. I'm just black. I'm a young black male growing up in America. So I was just writing about my life. I was writing about my experiences. And it was after I started sharing those poems at open mics, people would come up to me and be like, hey, I really appreciate the way you talk about race or justice or this. And I was like, I was just telling you what happened to me. That wasn't even on purpose. But then I realized something. I was like, oh, snap. Because it is in the context of story, right. And this is, Jesus did this a whole lot, right? He told parables. He was being challenged on huge theological concepts and doctrines, and so often he would answer with a story. And the story was sometimes personal, sometimes it was fictional, but it went past their defenses. So, who's your neighbor? He could have said, all people are created in the Imago Dei, blah, 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 blah. But he said, no. Who's your neighbor? Let me tell you a story about a guy who was traveling, got beat up. and this person who is supposed to be this spiritual person, this priest, he passed him, and all the folks who were expected to help him passed him. But then his enemy, his racial enemy of a different racial group stopped and he helped him out. Now you tell me, who's his neighbor, right? So it's like you're no longer arguing over the point. You're listening to a story, you're listening to a piece of art, and then you're like, oh dang, by the time it's over, you don't even realize what happened, and then you're like, oh snap, now I have to respond to this. So that's kind of what I realized about being at open mics. I'm like, man, there are people who, again, if I try to have this conversation in any other context, they would be so closed off to even starting it. Or people who, if I talk about faith, if I invite them to church, no, thank you. But if I'm at an open mic and I talk about my experience with faith, they're open to hearing it. So I think that's a beautiful part about it.
100% of the time, or do you have people who come up and say that, hey, that was too controversial, or I couldn't disagree more, or why are you here? Who invited you?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. But at least they heard it, And I mean, to me, if you're a person, whether you're an artist, a preacher, a public speaker of any kind, if you're talking about things that matter on a regular basis in front of people and you never offend somebody, then you probably ain't saying nothing. You're just walking on eggshells playing it safe, because there's no way, with the amount of diverse opinions in the world about everything, that you can't talk about things that matter without offending someone. To me, I don't have a problem offending someone. For me, it's always, why did I offend them? Did I offend them with the truth? Or did I offend them with the arrogant way I presented what I believe to be true? And there's a difference. But, I mean, I always find it fascinating that, Christ sent his disciples out with a message of hope and love and said, hey, by the way, don't be surprised when the world hates you. It's like you can be as loving and humble as you want. You still might get crucified. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? So, yeah.
Let me try a little word association. I've never done this before, but I'm going to take some of your words. I won't be able to do it in the spoken word fashion, which you've done it, but I'd love to give some of the things I saw that stood out to me, and then just go to you and just, what are you thinking, feeling? Why did you write what you wrote?
Yeah.
What's going on there? Stealing bread is the name. Okay. Poverty is supposed to be colorblind, but it's so closely tied to blackness. Terms used for low economic status are now synonymous with a culture, a people. Mm-hmm. Black people don't suffer from poverty. They are poverty. Mm-hmm. They are hood. We are poor men stealing bread, and I suggest that you do not despise me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a...
Does that feel weird to hear someone else saying it back to you?
No, I mean, maybe hearing a white person say it, yeah. But the thing about stealing bread is, I think, again, a lot of folks, so it's actually was inspired by a Bible verse that says, do not despise a thief if he steals to satisfy his hunger. Mm. And this is the thing. I think a lot of Christians, a lot of conservative Christians who, have a strong emphasis on right and wrong and morality, they often oversimplify really complex issues. So, stealing is wrong. We know this. God said it. We know stealing is wrong. However, there is a difference between someone who steals because they are hungry and starving, and someone who steals because they have no respect for another person's property and they're stealing out of greed. There's a difference between someone who has no respect for another nation's laws and someone who says, I live in such incredible poverty, my children might die. Yes, I'm willing to break a law to ensure that my children stay alive and have a future, or to flee a war and illegally cross a border so that they don't get a bomb dropped on their head. So it's like, that's what stealing bread is about, more in the context of black folks in America. From the outside in, I've seen a lot of well-meaning people think, they just need Jesus. They're just sinful, basically. They need to stop selling drugs and stop gangbanging and stop doing all this. And I'm like, if you actually got to know our stories, like, when slavery ended, you instantly had millions of black folks who were free, quote unquote, but they had no education. They had no community wealth or resource. And trying to get out of that, even if they were motivated, they faced prejudice at every turn from institutions that didn't want them to succeed, right? And from segregation and from exclusionary academia and exclusionary everything. And so a lot of the issues that exist in our community, even generations later, are a result of that, and people trying to make do. And I've met so many folks who have been drug dealers because they're trying to provide for their family, and I liken that to stealing bread, and once you get to know somebody and know communities that you might have stereotypes about, you're like, oh no, you aren't just careless people, but you're desperate folks, and your heart should look at them differently. Do not despise a thief if they steal to satisfy their hunger.
Wow. Carl's Jr.
Yeah.
Well, maybe one of the best works I think that you've written, actually. This is, and I quote, "What is the root about this thing? He wondered what his role was in it. We know that buying sex is wrong, but we use sex to sell everything. There's something between sex and the pleasure of acquisition. Masculinity has sexual exploitation attached to it. How do you say you can buy sexiness, but you can't buy sex?"
Yeah.
Where did that come from? Where did this whole poem come from?
Well, so I talk a lot about justice issues, and so I had gotten a lot of invitations to speak specifically on the issue of human trafficking. But one thing I do not like doing is acting like I'm an expert on something I don't know nothing about. And I personally didn't and still don't know a ton about the technical side of human trafficking, about girls getting abducted and how pimps operate. I don't know about all of that. But as I kept getting these invitations, I'm like, I feel like I need to say something to this issue. But I wanted to approach it in a way that I felt was honest. And so I started thinking, well, at the root of it, what is my relationship to human trafficking? And that was a strange and difficult question. And for me, I realized, well, the root of it is men and me growing up in this culture, men having wrong thinking about women, right? Objectifying them and all these things. And so I thought from there, well, where does this come from? Well, and I'm just going to be very blunt here. My very first memory of being sexually aroused by an image was a Carl's Jr. commercial. I was a kid, and I'm watching basketball with my dad, and I see a commercial trying to sell me a hamburger and fries. But their method of that was by having a woman with barely any clothes throwing soap suds all over herself while washing a car, and somehow
this has something
to do with burgers and fries. But what it was creating, and obviously it's not just Carl's Jr. It's all kind of. I mean, you name anything. You name Axe deodorant and men's. It's particularly things associated with maleness or male culture. So you talk about boxing, this very masculine sport. In between the rounds, you have women in bikinis, right? You talk about like hamburgers and meat, which I'm sure women love burgers too, but meat is associated with masculinity. So many things, football, all sports, there's always kind of the exploitation of women attached to it. But it's just these conflicting messages from culture, and one of them being, most folks, even non-religious folks, say, buying sex is wrong and it is a problem. You cannot buy sex. But then you say sex sells, right? And you use sex to sell everything. So you build this relationship between purchasing or spending money and receiving a certain degree of sexual pleasure. Even if it's not actual intercourse, you can go to Hooters and pay to have your chicken wings served by a voluptuous woman, and that's okay. You can go to a strip club and pay to watch a woman, arouse you sexually, and that's okay. But you can't actually buy sex. So when you grow up in a culture that, and it's not even just the extreme of going to strip clubs and things like that. Again, it's watching, basketball and seeing commercials. It's being in the grocery store and having a magazine row full of barely dressed people as a little boy, seeing that all my life. And so I think by no means like shifting the blame, but I think it's understanding helpful, because it's helpful to understand men who grow up and who have a conscience about this and feel bad, but they feel perverted, right? They feel like, I am so gross. I can't overcome my addiction to porn, or I can't overcome my sex addiction and all these things. And it's like, I think when we understand the context, hey, we were brainwashed from childhood, and we need to have grace for ourselves. And I would hope and pray that women who understand that could have patience and grace with us as we are trying to unlearn all of these things that we were subconsciously taught by the films and the commercials and the billboards and everywhere we went. You know, you could not escape it, you know, and so that's what that poem was about, understanding, hey, men, like, yes, we need to fight this. We need to repent of the way we've objectified women, but we also need to understand that we were victims in a different sense when we were young. And it's really hard to undo decades of brainwashing, you know, when you're an adult and finally realize that you have a problem.
You actually close this with the purity of your spirit has nothing to do with your sexual history.
Mm-hmm.
There are saints with a dark, I love this, there are saints with a dark past
Mm-hmm.
and virgins with lustful hearts.
Mm-hmm.
Discipline and self-control makes you more of man, not less of one. And any woman who endures abuse and survives should be honored for her strength and not despised for her scars.
Mm-hmm.
Powerful.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have a hard time forgiving themselves for the mistakes they've made. But also, in faith communities, I think there is an overemphasis on the actual physical acts of having sex. Like, don't do that. Like, that is like the greatest sin in people's mind. And yet, I went to a Bible college, and half the dudes in my dorm were addicted to pornography. You know, and they were virgins. You know, it was like, it doesn't make any sense. And so it's like, we're missing the point here. We have this culture that's terrified. Like, some of y'all ain't held a girl's hand, ain't kissed a girl at all, and you watch porn every night after you get back from class studying systematic theology. You know, and so I think, again, those type of things come from a culture that is afraid to talk about these things. Because instead of like everyone just fronting like, oh, we're remaining pure, and we're not. We should be, but we're not. And we have a problem. Can we please talk about why is it that all these men who are studying to want to go into ministry have such a hard time with this? And I think part of that is they haven't had the freedom to openly discuss their struggle and have accountability and encouragement. All they have is the shame. And it's like, oh, it's shameful, especially if you're in a community of faith. If people knew about this, then I'd never be able to, you know, do the things I want to do. So then you just keep it in isolation, and it just gets worse. You know, so that's another thing I wanted to do with Carl's Jr. Just open that conversation. Yeah. You are not alone in this. Let's just be real about it, you know?
So much of your poetry has to do with proximity. You talk even in veiled ways about coming close, actually understanding the story, building a relationship. I was listening to one, Is Justice Worth It? You never stop fighting for your own. I mean, literally making that person who's been objectified or the object of injustice, wait, that's my sister, or that's my mother, that's my aunt. Talk about the proximity issue. You even mentioned it when you talked about the parable of the Good Samaritan. That is a parable about proximity. Someone came close. Someone crossed the road.
Yeah.
Why is proximity so important to you?
I think it's the most effective way to rid yourself of prejudice. If you have ideas about a people group and you don't actually know any of them, your ideas are probably going to be very wrong, and you're going to hold them strongly, you know. But then when you start to build relationships, then it starts to gradually, oh, well, maybe not all of them are like this, just most of them. And then you're like, well, maybe not most of them. Well, maybe that's just a stereotype and there's no truth in it. You know, or maybe it seems to be true, but there's reasons why those things are happening and they're not what I assumed. You know, it's not just that they're bad people, right? And so, you know, no matter what it is, you know, whether you're talking about different faiths or, you know, different ethnicities, it's like, how many black people do you know? How many Muslims do you actually know? There's plenty who live here. All these ideas you have about them and their religion, or them and their people group, and them or their values, whatever the group is, or gay people, how many do you actually know? You know, oh, they're all disgusting perverts. Okay, how many do you know? How many have you ever had over for dinner? You know, and I think that there's no way you can get close to a people group and have friends in that people group without having your ideas about them affected in some significant way. I don't know what that will be, but your perspective will definitely change. And the most prejudiced people I've met usually have a very non-diverse community, as far as folks who they interact with. So
one last image that also comes very, very strongly is the image of humanness, someone's humanity. In your Human Persons, you talk about, and you also did this in Man Without a Name. Why is it so critical in approaching issues of justice to lift up a human being? You make that absolutely critical in almost everything that you write.
Yeah.
This is a human being. This is made in the image of God. I don't think you state that.
Yeah.
I think I'm putting words in your mouth on that one, but that definitely rises to the occasion almost everything you do.
Yeah, and that's what it is. It's because of my belief that, I think in that poem, Human Persons, I forgot exactly how I say it, but I have this concept of, when people mess up, they say, oh, I'm only human. I think that's so wrong, because what it's saying is, I made this mistake because I'm a human. It's implying that humans are inherently, in their humanity, like messed up or flawed, and I don't agree with that. I think, I say, oh, I'm only human. No, being human is not an excuse for wrongdoings. It's what makes them unacceptable. The fact that we are human is why we have a conscience and realize that that's not okay, right? Because we're made in the likeness of God. And we realize you can't just do that. We're not animals. We're humans. That's a good thing. The problem is not our humanity. The problem is our brokenness, our sinfulness, which is separate from our humanity. It's something that came later. Our humanity existed before that. And this was never meant to be a part of that. So to me, being human is good, not because I'm worshiping humanity, but because our humanity is good because we're created in the image of God. We're the only beings who who make choices in the way we make choices and tell stories in the way we tell stories and have community in the same, animals don't write poetry or don't read history books and try to not repeat the mistakes of generations of previous lines. There's something so beautiful about humanity, but it's often talked about like, oh, I'm just a human. Like, no, you're a beautiful human created in the image of God, and you're broken and you're flawed. But again, our humanity is what calls us to something greater, not excuses our wrongdoings.
Right. What projects are you working on currently? Where are you going, and what are we going to see from Micah in the future?
Yeah, in the very near future, hopefully mid-November, I'm working on an album of hip hop. Though it's mainly hip hop. There's 2 or 3 poems on it, but it's called A Time Like This, and it's just, honestly, I got first very frustrated and then very inspired. Racial tension has been a part of America as long as I've been alive and for a long time. But in the last few years, I think things have gotten more tense and brought to the surface. I think that's undeniable. Yeah. And so I was feeling some tension. And, I believe there is a time to gently explain things to people. And I believe there is a time where a more straightforward and harsher rebuke is required. And some of the things I've seen done and said in communities, particularly in communities of faith, have just broken my heart. And I'm like, man, I have gently trying to explain this to y'all for years, and now I feel like it's time to turn some tables. It's time to say, this is not right. This should not be a part of the community of faith of the house of God, and it is.
You're not talking about microaggressions.
No, I'm talking about very just
pretty bold,
blatant prejudice, discrimination, and the album talks mainly about racial issues, but not exclusively. But it's broken my heart. Like, people that I'm like, man, these were my friends, my classmates, do and say so many things that are just so misinformed about Black folks, and I'm like, that's not okay. And so that's what the album is about, addressing those issues. But then also it's a call to community, but not a superficial. What I got frustrated was this call for peace, but really it's just a call for calm. Like, hey, let's all get along. But you can't really have good relationships if you're not actually addressing the injustice.
Right.
So it's like you want to have peace, but you don't want to actually fix any of the thing that people are upset about. You just want us to stop complaining or
No
stop
Truth and
marching.
Reconciliation Commission.
Yeah,
Nothing.
you know, and so it's like, yeah, so that's kind of what it's about, and it's definitely gonna be one of my more controversial projects. I've always talked about these things, but this one is very concentrated, like almost every song, and so I think it's gonna be a lot, but I think it's necessary for where we're at.
If we wanted to get in touch with you or see more of your work, where do we go?
Yeah, I have a website which is just my name, MicahBournes.com. I have Instagram, Facebook, and it's all just my first and last name. I'm very accessible. Everything goes directly to me, but also everything I do, I want it to be a tool. So I have my albums available for free download through my website. I have 2 albums of spoken word poetry. I have an album of blues music, and I have some hip hop on there. And the new project I'm working on will also be a free download when it's released. But you can also purchase it on iTunes. But yeah, it's a resource to me. I'm like, I have a ton of videos embedded on my website and on YouTube. To me, I just want folks to have it. I'm like, yeah.
Well, it's an amazing resource. Thank you for joiing us at the gathering.
sure.
I can't wait to hear what's going to happen here because you're here and you're
appreciate it.
supposed to be here.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.